Welcome to Syntax. Today we're going to be talking about how to pick a JavaScript framework. So there's a new JavaScript framework that just came out, One Stack or One. It's from Nate, the guy behind Tamagui. And anytime I'm like one of these new frameworks comes out, I sort of like take a look at the docs and do a quick scan. And I found myself being like, I'm starting to do this like little checklist of does it have X, Y, and Z? Mm-hmm. How does it approach these things? What is its thoughts on these things? And I thought that would be kind of an interesting episode where like let's rattle through that list of things that you have to think about before you dive into a framework, because certainly I've been there before where you go all in on something and you realize, oh crap, like they don't have this yet or at all, or they don't like it and I need it. So now we got to switch. So that's what we got for you today. My name is Wes. With me, as always, Mr. Scott Tolinsky, and we got CJ on today as well. Hello, CJ.
Hello.
Howdy. I wasn't supposed to be here. So
yeah, unfortunately, we have Scott.
Yeah, I was going to be in Florida, which by the time you're listening to this, hopefully the hurricane fizzled out, but there is a large hurricane headed to Florida, so I had to cancel all my plans. And we have a couple of really sad kids who aren't going to Disney right now. So
that's a bummer.
Huge bummer. All right, well, before we get into it, you know what, Wes? When you're picking a framework, you got to make sure they have a Sentry integration. But let me tell you, I feel like that's hardly even a conversation, considering Sentry does such an incredible job about having integrations for everything. It's kind of wild. You could find literally anything, and if Sentry themselves hasn't made it, there's one within the community, whether that is, Rust, JavaScript. I mean, we're talking languages, but we're also talking frameworks. They have even like a Svelte kit wizard. You just run the dang wizard, and it adds all the files for you and sets you up. And you get all that cool stuff, all the amazing features from Sentry out of the box. So all you have to do is sign up, run the wizard, or at worst, copy and paste a few things. And one of the cool things that Sentry does is they even include all of your correct IDs and stuff in the copy and paste bubble. So you don't even have to go hunt down IDs when you're going to do that. So check it out.
You want to take a guess at how many specific JavaScript integrations Sentry has? Just for JavaScript, not for Kotlin or Elixir or Java
25.
or Go. Oh, that was pretty good. 28. Wow.
Whoa.
Oh, sorry. What were you going to guess, CJ?
I was going to guess 50. I was off.
50?
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot.
28.
Yeah, that's quite a few. So let's get into it.
Wait, before that, head on over to sentry.io/syntax sign up and get 2 months free. By the way, when you do that, you do have to use the coupon code TASTYTREAT, all lowercase, all one word. We had some folks saying that it was only giving you 14 days. It says on the page you got to use Tasty Treat, but that's easy to miss. So use the coupon code Tasty Treat and you'll get those 2 months for free.
All right, let's get on into it. I thought let's start off talking about what is a framework, right? Like we're only talking today about like JavaScript frameworks, but in that realm, what is a JavaScript framework and what is a library? CJ, what do you think?
I consider a framework something that's all inclusive, right? Like a lot of times something might call itself a framework, but then you need to do one specific thing and you got to go install another library or another package. So for me, if I can get a lot of stuff done without having to reach for other packages, I would consider the thing I'm working in a framework.
Yeah, like if you could sit down and build a application with the base things, like I'm thinking like routing, What are some of like those other basic things that would make a router is probably the biggest one. Like maybe a state management is another one.
Yeah, I mean we're gonna hit a lot of these in this episode, but if I want to be a little controversial here, I am going to take the stance that I don't believe a framework is a framework without auth in a database, or at least some sort of solution for that. For me, everything else is just kind of like a pre-framework. It is a tool to build things. Like I wouldn't consider Next.js or SvelteKit even a framework. Granted, you can build websites, but like with those tools, you're always having to tack on, 10 additional choices of your own. And to me, a framework is something more like Rails or Django or any of these things that do more of it for you.
Interesting. Okay, so let's give a couple quick examples of what they are so people are listening. In the React.js space, there is obviously Next.js is an example of one. We have the TanStack Start is another example. We have Remix. What else do we have in the space?
There's Next. I mean, even you could even say Vite React or
not really.
Adonis.
Adonis is a good example of one. That one's even probably fits your criteria of it includes absolutely everything, And then at a certain point, at a certain point it moves into like being like almost a CMS, right?
Yeah. And Redwood is another good one because that also has opinions about like using GraphQL. So like they choose your whole system of working with data for you.
Yeah.
I fired up Redwood the other day because they now have their server component thing in action because like there's not a lot of frameworks are like rolling out support for React server components just yet or at all. They're kind of like, I'm not sure about it. It's kind of this weird spot right now. So Redwood.js is one of the, I think the third one to implement it. It's still super early. Like it's probably not even worth trying just yet, especially if you're going to think about running in production. But I did get it up and running and tested it out.
Yeah. For me, Wes, the distinction between a CMS and a framework there is that a framework to me includes the database and the ORM, right? But a CMS includes the UI. To
like
me
a whole
is like
admin interface.
That to me is where the line is drawn, because if I look at even something like Pocket Base, which is just the back end, that to me is still not even a CMS in my mind, because I might be comfortable giving that to a client, but I'm not the same level of comfortable giving that to a client as I am with a Drupal, WordPress, Ghost, any of those things backends that are, definitive CMSs.
What would you consider Pocket Base then? I know it doesn't matter, like it doesn't matter at the end of the day, but I kind of like talking about this stuff. It's kind of funny.
Pocket Base for me is just a managed backend. It's a backend service, data engine. The cool thing about Pocket Base is that it does include auth. It includes email. It's almost like a data framework without the UI, like a headless data framework. But that's a tough distinction. It's all a pick and choose out of all of these different categories that we're going to discuss.
Hey, San Francisco, we're going to be in town for GitHub Universe on October 28th, and we're doing a syntax meetup. You don't have to be going to the GitHub Universe conference to meet up with us, but if you are in San Francisco, come hang out from 5 to 7 p.m. October 28th. We're going to be at the Bear Bottle Beer Garden in Salesforce Park. Admission is free. We're not going to charge you, but come hang out, and you need to grab a ticket via Eventbrite. So we put the link in our socials, in the newsletter. We'll put it in the show notes as well. Come check it out. Come hang out. Scott's going to be there. I'm going to be there. The whole team's going to be there. It's going to be exciting. See you then. Do we want to go real quick into a couple examples of frameworks for Vue, Svelte, and Angular?
Yeah. Also in the Vue ecosystem, there's Nuxt. And I guess what's nice about the Vue ecosystem is that's kind of the only one. You don't have a bunch of choices. But it is nice. And they're working really hard to start to integrate things like databases and caching and some of the stuff that you would see in other ecosystems like in Rails or Laravel. It seems like Nuxt is definitely trying to be that as well.
Yeah. And then Svelte, same thing. I mean, there are other ways to write Svelte. You can just use it, but it's pretty much Svelte kit or bust at this point, which again, I think from the Vue and Svelte angles of that, it feels nice, that there isn't a billion options. And for Angular, there is Analog.js, which I don't know how ubiquitous that is in the Angular ecosystem, but it's definitely the one that I've heard of the most.
Mm-hmm. Same. And then like outside of all of these, there's also other languages that run on JSX or run on multiple ones. Like Astro will use Svelte components or React components, like it's kind of its own thing. Seems like Astro's becoming really popular. And then there's Solid JS and Solid Start is another one in that space. There's QuickJS. So Solid uses JSX, so does QuickJS. There's quite a few in the space that still use, even Hono X, still use JSX, but do not use like React per se.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Astro is on a good path here. Like, it kind of seems like the great unifier. The fact that like you can take any framework and like they have SSR, they're coming out with database solutions and routing solutions. Yeah, Astro is kind of like the all-inclusive, or like the one that bridges the gap between a lot of these frameworks.
I do have to say, if I was to pick one that wasn't SvelteKit, I think it would be an easy choice for me to pick Astro.
How come? Just because you can use everything in it? Or just like the approach in general just seems to make a lot of sense.
The approach in general, I like the islands. I like that it is kind of like you're opting into client side where you want it, but that's not hard to do. I like that how co-located everything is. You know, one thing that was kind of a bummer for me with SvelteKit is that before they were version 1, you used to have server code co-located in your component with a module script. And I'm like, I think a lot of the Svelte folks didn't like that. Like Rich specifically said he hated that because it was like co-locating too much. But me personally, it saved me from having to write a whole nother file for sometimes very simple code, like really simple stuff. And it was like really obvious to me that you have a second script tag and this is your server stuff and this is your client stuff. But he didn't like the commingling of the two. And I personally, I liked it. So I like having that kind of like co-location of, it reminds me of PHP stuff, right? Your UI next to your server implementation.
Honestly, I would like that too. I asked that, like when React Server Components came out, I was like, why do we have to have a separate file for the server bits, you know? And there's all these rules around how it works. And the answer to that was, I think it's because it was too complicated for the bundler. And because it's also a little bit risky in terms of, you're just importing client side and server side code into the same file, and you could accidentally do something you don't know. So very clear distinction of that. But I'm on your side, Scott. I kind of would like that.
Yeah, I know. Maybe it's just because I'm experienced enough to know where that
like maybe if we could put like 8 emojis of like a server between the code, you know, like that's how you mark it.
Yeah,
and then it's okay.
Yeah. But I think to that point, Scott, that I feel like that's kind of why it's a good thing. Like if you have newer developers or maybe people that aren't familiar with the JavaScript ecosystem, having the separation kind of helps draw those lines between front end and back end. But it is more mundane to have to create a new file every time you need like a simple loader. Yeah.
All right, well, let's get into the actual questions of what we need to answer here. The first one we have is like, where do you want to, or what do you need to ship, or where do you need to ship, right? Like probably shipping to the web is by far the most popular, but that's not the only place where an app needs to be powered, right? It might also be a native app. It might be a web view. It might be a desktop application. So specifically for people who are looking at like React Native, that's a big question of how much can I reuse in my React Native application? Or can I simply just write it in such a way with something like Temagui or React Native Web where I can reuse it? Like a lot of the Twitter code, a lot of Blue Sky is simply just a single code base that deploys to React Native and the web.
Yeah, I mean, and some of these things play nicer than others, right? I think actually, you know, part of this discussion, you know, got kicked off because of the onestack.dev. And to me, one of the most compelling things about OneStack, besides the data story, was that it is very focused on write once, deploy everywhere, but also like deploy everywhere with a native solution and not just like a web view. Now, granted, web view apps can be fine, but like, man, if something makes it easier for me to write React Native or write once and deploy everywhere and actually have it work well natively on those systems, that's pretty compelling. Next one is, how do you render it? Now, there's a whole bunch of these different distinctions and the boundaries are kind of blurred here, but, you know, client-side rendering, server-side rendering, do you need it to be static? Do you need a combination of all three? And largely what these depend on is what you're shipping, right? Does an application like Sentry, that's a dashboard of UI things showing you your errors, does that need to be server-side rendered? Probably not. No. there's not a whole lot of reasons why you would need that to be server-side rendered. Sometimes you'd go server-side rendering for performance, but a lot of the times it's really just, so that you're not just shipping a blank HTML page. And I do think like we went a little hard on the server-side rendering story when a lot of these applications, especially ones that very well may run inside of a WebView app or something like that, they just don't need server-side rendering and all of the challenges that come along with it. Now, granted, if you're building a site like Syntax is an interactive site. There's a player. There's all this great navigation stuff going on. But there's also a lot of data that we would love to be indexed, a lot of data we would love to exist in the HTML. That makes perfect sense to be server-side rendering. And sometimes you have, like a product where the application is client-side rendered, but the marketing pages, the about pages, the docs, all those things are even statically generated. So sometimes you need a combination of all these things. So something that might make it more flexible is really nice. Like for instance, in SvelteKit, in a route by route basis, you can say this is a pre-rendered static route. And that gives you the flexibility to determine what is static and what's not within your app.
Yeah, that being able to like choose which one is server rendered, what's client rendered, which one is pre-rendered static is really nice, because like back when Gatsby started getting Jamstack was really popular, like we realized, oh yeah, pre-rendering a lot of the stuff is a great idea. But eventually we hit this point where they go, oh yeah, I don't want everything to be statically rendered, and then the answer to that was, well, you just have to do it on the client, but then we're like, okay, then I have to make an API, and then this is starting to get annoying. It's nice to be able to just opt into one of these rendering, or even just like rehydrating on the client. That's what SvelteKit does, right? You can render it all on the client, but then you pick it up on the you can render it on the server, but then you pick it up all on the client.
Word.
Yeah, and a lot of these modern meta frameworks, so like Next.js, SvelteKit, they all have this, and even Astro have this idea of route by route rendering. So any route you can choose, this will be SSR, this will be CSR. I will say, when I worked at a consultancy, like this was kind of before the explosion of meta frameworks, and we essentially just had like two internal apps. So like if we needed a marketing page or SSR, that would be like WordPress, but then the internal would just be built with like Create React app and an API. So I will say, like, it doesn't have to include all of this stuff, especially if you find a framework that maybe doesn't include the thing that you need for this one specific use case. I don't know, build two apps, host it on subdomain, something like that.
Yeah, often you see like the marketing website for a product and the actual product itself being two totally separate code bases, just because the overlap that they have there is very small. And often the marketing wants to do so many things. They want to test stuff, they want to try new things, they want to do redesigns, and that pace at which they move is or how they move is too different than the actual product, right? And it just doesn't make sense. You certainly can share stuff between the two, especially if you have like a design system, but almost always you're seeing two separate code bases for marketing and the actual product.
Yeah, a lot of times too, that's even like they need a CMS, they need different tools to publish, and they're not going to wait for some developer to make a code push for it or whatever. Yeah.
The next one we have here is, where are you deploying it to? I think like this story has gotten really good lately, because it almost doesn't matter where you're deploying it to. Actually, I'm doing a talk in a couple days, and I'm talking about all of the different JavaScript runtimes. We've got Bun and Dino and Cloudflare Workers and obviously Node. And then we have Node serverless. And then we have Node that will spin up and spin down as you need it. And then we have traditional Node running on an actual server, right? And I was thinking about like, there's so many of these runtimes, but it almost doesn't matter how you write your code, because if you're writing it in standard space JavaScript, obviously there's a couple little things here and there, but even Cloudflare announced the other day they're using this thing called unenv, which is part of the like un.js ecosystem, and it just like polyfilled like almost the rest of the Node APIs, and now Cloudflare is sitting at like 98% Node compat, which is amazing.
Yeah, I'm going to be contradictory, because you know what, Wes? I've noticed that good podcasts, they always have one person who's like, I disagree. You know?
Okay. What do you
So
got?
I disagree. No, it matters where you host. No, it doesn't. I agree with you, man. It doesn't. Everything is gotten really good in the hosting space. But one thing I will say about this hosting is I do really enjoy the adapter pattern that a lot of frameworks are picking up, where you can plug and play the adapter that you're going to use to deploy these things, because I don't think, this might come off as targeted, I don't think having your application work on one specific host is the right way to do it, personally.
And you're talking about Vercel and Next.js, right? Like we don't have to dance around this, right? Everyone's talking about that.
I just don't think to me personally, I believe in a little bit more of an open system where like the best experience for a framework shouldn't be tied to a specific host. Now, I get it. The company that makes that framework, they are funding the development of that framework with their service, and I get that. That all makes sense to me. But me personally, I don't want to be tied to one host to have the best experience to my framework.
Yeah. And people are going to be saying like, well, you can run Next.js anywhere, right? And like, yeah, you can run it as a node server,
yes.
But I think where the lines start to get blurred is that so many of Next.js features are tied to infrastructure. And if you want to be able to replicate those nice features, it can be really hard, right? And like even Cloudflare came out the other day, they are moving their Cloudflare had a Next.js adapter called Next on Pages. And it worked pretty good. I run our website on it, but there's still some spots here and there that were kind of frustrating. And it looks like they're moving over to, I think, were they funding Open Next? Something like that, where they're trying to get it to just work properly.
Yeah.
Which is Dax's thing. We had Dax on the podcast. He runs this thing called Open Next. And we're trying to get Next.js to run as on different serverless platforms, right? Yeah. Hosting Next.js on a node platform is relatively easy. I do that as well.
Yeah, word.
I think in general, like just the adapter pattern itself is a really good software architecture pattern. Like we've known this for the longest time. I mean, Vercel only came about, I guess, like the last 10 years or so. But for the longest time, you want to write your stuff in a more agnostic way. So when things change, when hardware changes, like you don't have to do as many updates. And so these frameworks that support adapters like SvelteKit, and Nuxt, and I've been working with Hono. Hono's a backend framework. It's not necessarily rendering, but they have adapters for all the runtimes. And so you write your code in a runtime agnostic way and then just plug in the adapter. And I think that's definitely the way to go.
And the way that those adapters work, we should say, is that when you run a CI to build your website, the adapter will determine what the output looks like, like, oh, is there a folder called _netlify and there's a functions inside of that, or does the pattern look a little bit different? And also, does the code need to be polyfilled or transpiled in any way so that it runs on that specific, like Cloudflare usually has a little bit of weird things with their bindings, trying to be able to hook it up to the database. So the adapter pattern will often take care of a lot of that. And I agree. That's the way to go.
Yeah. Well, last thing I'll add to that is, yes, this adapter pattern works, but also you do have to be careful of like web standards. So I've been fighting this because I'm trying to get Hono deployed to a bunch of different places. But because I didn't use import extensions, which is a web standard, like when you're importing modules, you need to include that .js. If you don't, then you need a build step to do it. So that's the one caveat there is like, you got to make sure you're doing all the web standard stuff.
Well. That's the story of my life is I'm preaching web standards until there's something that I want to do, like import CSS as raw text. And Vite does that. That's not a standard. Or use TypeScript. That's not a standard. But I also want those things as well. So I think Vite's doing a lot in this ecosystem where it's like, write to 90% standards, and then Vite will take care of the rest of the funky stuff.
Yeah. The next question we have is, how do you store data? So there's a lot of different ways to do this. And one question to also ask is, do you have an existing API? So this is how I've built a lot of the applications in my career is we have a separate backend, right? The API already exists. There's potentially a separate team or a separate product that's working on that. And it's our job to kind of build the front end and integrate with it. And so in those scenarios, I wouldn't necessarily need a backend first framework to build my app with. And then also you have to think about the kind of APIs, right? So is it GraphQL? Is it REST? Is it something else like gRPC? In that case, does the framework have an adapter or a library that's going to support working with those kinds of existing APIs?
Yeah, you see a lot of people being like, well, I don't want all of this full stack framework because like we have a team that runs our API and it's a Python app and it's been around for 10 years. We just want to be able to build an interface for that application, right? And if that's the case, then yeah, you can still do server rendered and fetch that data on the server, but for a lot of those people, it's not necessary. They have everything in place, all the auth, all the rate limiting. They want to go straight from the client directly to the API.
Exactly.
Yeah, to me, this is a question of what the greenfield is like here. If your app is like, brand new, you potentially just need an API or you need it tightly integrated, whatever. But if it is a brand new greenfield app, I typically want the framework to do more for me. And if it's an existing API, I will want it to do less for me because, yes, I already have Auth. I already have an API. I already have all this data stuff. And all I want to do is fetch the stuff either for server or for client and interact with it on my UI. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different choices here. If it's an existing API, is it GraphQL? And if you are picking GraphQL, does it make sense to pick a framework that integrates tightly with REST or vice versa? An integrated server, is your data loading via RPC? Like maybe you're using even something like tRPC to make that boundary a little bit blurrier. Is it a REST-based system? Do you need a GraphQL-based system and have it run on your own server, or do you need to have a separate one? There's all these choices that you need to make. And even as far as that, we get into like database. Does your framework include a database? How many actual frameworks these days include a database, or at least database adapters? And typically that's just like an ORM, right? I think that might be a better thing to say here. Does it include an ORM? Do you need to fetch this data from your server or from the client? You might, fetching data from the client often looks like what you're using something like Supabase. You sign up, you create your database, and then you're basically doing subscriptions or calls from the client side for all of your data transactions.
And then the last one we have, which is something I've been checking on all of these new frameworks that come out, is does it have RPC or server actions or server functions or form actions? They're called something in every single framework, but essentially what it is can you call server code from the client either programmatically, like when you click on a button, or via a form submit? And like, what does that look like? So Astro now has that. It just rolled out just under a month ago, which is pretty cool. That's one thing I looked up on one is they don't have that at the moment. The Tanstack Start stuff is looking really cool. They have that pretty much. I would say most of these frameworks are starting to implement some sort of, even if it's not a React server components, it's some way to call server code from the client and pass data back and forth. And the benefit to that is that you don't have to set up a whole endpoint and be able to, all right, what parameters is it gonna run and whatever. You simply just define your function in one file, and then you can call that function in another file. All the types flow all the way through. SvelteKit does a beautiful job at this type of stuff to the point where it's like if you need to code a quick feature into the website, into syntax, it's like so easy because it's like, oh, yeah, I just make a folder. I got my Svelte component here, and then I have a server.js thing here where I can implement my endpoints, and they can just call each other.
Yeah, and even to go along with that, Wes, is can you write endpoints in this framework? Because, a lot of frameworks, you might not even have that server-side component. Or for me, even, like, I have an app that is my habit tracker. It's a client-side rendered app. And you might think you do not need endpoints for a client-side rendered app. But you know what? I also run sync endpoints from that app for my data service. And even if my app is only running client-side itself on, like, let's say a native app, like I have like a Tory WebView app, the server is not running on that device at all, but it is still making sync calls to a server that exists that's in the same code base and actually the same app that I'm deploying to the web version of the app. So, like, can you write your API within your application and not have it be directly tied to the application itself?
I can't stop thinking about when we had Tanner on the other day, and he said like why do you even need API endpoints? Can your route just return JSON? Like, isn't that what an endpoint is? And it can either return a component or it can return JSON. I thought, that's actually that's a good point. I guess the other thing you need to think about there is like it does have middleware, and what does the middleware story look like? That's my biggest beef with Next.js is the middleware story is not good, in my opinion. I much prefer something like the Express middleware, or now like Hono's middleware is much better, in my opinion.
Yeah, I had that same experience with Next.js where like literally you can only have one middleware file. And so if you want to do custom things based on route, like the code gets really messy, and it was not great to work with.
I had asked some of the authors of the middleware of why they did it that way, and they said they initially built it the way that we're talking. Like, I want every route to have its own middleware, but they said that it was hard to stack them together. I think it is a little bit more tricky when you are using route-based file-based routing versus like a defined route in your code.
Yeah.
So sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay. But I mean, on that point, like that's another kind of like gripe I had with Next.js. I think I'm getting used to it, but the idea that you can't even get access to the request inside of a server component. Like they have helpers to get headers or to get cookies, but like every other framework I've ever used is like, okay, you get the context, right? This is request based. There's a HTTP request came into my app in order for me to be able to render this thing, but I can't access it. And so like they have their reasons around it, but it is definitely a little bit more cumbersome when you're trying to get access to those kinds of things. But one thing I wanted to add that Scott talked about in terms of like Greenfield, I think the JavaScript ecosystem and JavaScript developers potentially get a lot of flack from people outside the ecosystem. Like, why are you building your backend in JS? But I think that's one of the beautiful things is this idea of being able to call the code with just a function call. Because with the RPC, and later on we're going to talk about like type safety, like literally the dev experience is super fast, right? You can literally write a function and then just call it directly in your client-side code. And then when it all gets deployed and everything, it's in a nice and secure way. It's living as an API function. It's potentially living as client-side code. And so that's one of the things you really can't get if you do build things completely separate. You're going to have some sort of way that you have to share types or copy pasting of code. And when you decide to use one of these like full stack meta frameworks, that's one of the biggest benefits is like the dev experience of working with both the client and the server in such a tightly coupled way.
It's so good. And like, if you have a dependency that's like huge, or you're like, I don't want to do this on the client, like highlighting code is a great example. Code highlighters on the client are super heavy. They have to download the whole code highlighting library. You have to download if you have CSS, JavaScript, HTML on the page, that's 3 different highlighters it has to go ahead and then download. And then it has to do the parsing of it. You could just put all of that on the server, do it all on the server. You can cache it really easily and then simply just deliver HTML with some classes on it.
I know
great.
JavaScript haters don't understand just how nice it is to have that kind of interop between your server and your client and just have it be so well connected. Types, even code, like no context switching, naming conventions, all that stuff. You don't want to worry about multiple languages or whatever, one code base, even one process, whatever. It is such a good experience. And that's why I choose to write JavaScript on the server personally. The problem with that is we're just in this world where there is no complete solution tip to tail. Is tip to tail how they say that, Wes? You would know, right?
Yeah, tip to tail or snout to tip. I think it's tip to tail. I usually goof these up, so let's look it up. Tip to tail method of adding vectors includes drawing the first vector on a graph. No, I usually say soup to nuts.
Soup to nuts. Yeah, I don't understand that one.
Soup to nuts is an American English idiom that conveys the meaning of from beginning to end, derived from the description of a full course dinner. Soup to nuts may refer to soup to nuts film. But who's having
nuts?
Is nuts the last thing you have in a meal?
Maybe that's what people used to do at like super fancy meals or something. I don't know.
Yeah. I'm soup to cookie. I don't know. Yeah.
Soup to cake.
Soup to cake.
There you go. Auth do you need authentication? This is an odd one that I'm surprised is not in a lot of the frameworks. So we have Redwood.js has auth built in, Adonis.js has auth built in. And we were talking on Twitter the other day about Adonis.js, just as an aside, like when we had the Taylor Otwell episode out, we asked, like, why is there no Laravel for JavaScript? And a lot of people came out and said, Adonis.js is the move, and like Redwood is also kind of in that space. And then I have the question is like, why aren't they more popular though? Like, do you guys actually have any thoughts on that?
I think people just like their tools, and you look at something like Adonis or any of these things that make all those choices for you. Like if I look at these things, I say, can I use Svelte with this? Which, like, I know that's like a ridiculous thing because people just suck it up, use JSX, use React, whatever. But it matters to me. I don't want to, and I have that choice. So therefore, I'm going to make myself suffer by using smaller bespoke tools instead of something that's more complete. But I just do think it's people like their tools and everything like that. Or here's the thing: just things have taken hold in the meta, whether that is the frameworks of choice here and there. And some things haven't. And because those things haven't, the jobs aren't there, or the tutorials aren't there, or the hype isn't there for some specific reason. And therefore, it just hasn't caught on. So it could be a number of like really inconsequential, or like not inconsequential, but really mundane and dumb things like hype that cause something to not work or not take on that way.
And I think it comes down to just the sheer number of options. Like one thing about the JavaScript ecosystem is like, because we're writing JavaScript, typically you see the source. Like it's source visible by design, like even when you're publishing something to NPM. And so with the like explosion of NPM and NPM packages, like there's just so many choices and everyone has another opinion. So they just fork a library and like write their own version. And so like that's kind of what we're up against. I mean, I think like it kind of like takes someone who has experience or who has opinions that at least other people can get behind to make those decisions. Because I think that's kind of what happened with Laravel and Taylor Otwell. Like he made those decisions up front. People trust him, and now it's the way to go. But like if you look at Adonis.js, like I mean, I'm not super familiar with it, but I mean, what choices has it made? Like,
it's
are they the popular choices?
Back-end framework. Yeah, it's been around for a long time. It doesn't make any decisions on the client side. So it is Laravel in that regard, that it's all client rendered, and then you can use whatever, it's all server rendered. You can use whatever you want on the client. But even Redwood.js, I've been kind of rooting for them to pick up a bit more steam. But I think it is, at the end of the day, is I want an opinionated JavaScript framework as long as it's my opinions at the moment.
That's right. Yes, that's exactly right, Wes. That's exactly how I feel. One thing one reason I think that people don't, or that like Auth doesn't get built deeply into a lot of frameworks, is just the basis of a lot of these frameworks don't come with an ORM. If they came with an ORM, then Auth would be trivial to add, because an ORM, connects to the database, and that's really the big thing, is you need to adapt to whatever database the person wants to use. Or because if you lock onto something like Meteor died because they built so tightly into MongoDB. They built so tightly into MongoDB that people who didn't accept that just totally, left it or moved away or whatever. But if they would have at some point been able to write an adapter that worked for, Postgres or MySQL or whatever, I think people would have stuck around a lot more to these things. So you need an ORM that's flexible enough, and that then would have the ability to have like a smooth auth experience. As far as auth packages and things go, there's a number of things if you're in the next ecosystem, Auth.js. Lucia was a good option, but recently I saw the maintainer announced end of life, which to me I don't necessarily understand.
Why? I couldn't figure out why.
I think you actually touched on it, Scott. One of his biggest points was maintaining the database adapters was the biggest amount of time spent, and he didn't want to spend that time anymore.
To me, that's not that valid, because the auth stuff really exists in that you have he has a number of his own little tools, right? But that's where the stuff that people need in the auth things. I wrote my own auth package I called Drop Auth, and to me, the adapters portion is really super small. And the adapters portion is just like, all right, you've done the comparison. Now all I need to do is save the data to the database. So the adapter portion is just saving that information to the database. The problem with tools like Lucia is that they want it to be everything to everyone. They wanted to support how everyone did their auth instead of being opinionated. These are the fields. These are the auth methods, whatever. Yeah. And when I tried to use Lucia, I was like, there's too many things that I have to do personally here. It feels like I'm writing my own auth, where I would prefer something that makes more decisions for me and is a little bit more wrapped up in there without having to like support a billion adapters for a billion different things. Yeah.
Yeah, that was my experience with, I say Lucia. I don't know if it's Lucia, but
it's Lucia well. Because it's based Lucia? On the island St. Lucia, which is where I went on my honeymoon. And my dog, Lucy, her name is spelled like Lucia, but it's Lucy after the island. It's a beautiful island.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. But yeah, that was my experience too. Like when I implemented Lucia into a SvelteKit app, and then I've also tried implementing it into like a Hono app, and also Next.js. But every time I was just like, you've basically showed me what I kind of just want to write this code myself. I have to do all. I mean, but that might be the point that the maintainer's trying to make is like we will still continue to provide these kind of utilities and examples, but it's up to you. So you can adapt it to your own needs and your own database and whatever else. But that was my experience. I was like, I added it and I was like, I could have just written this myself. But at the same time, I've done it before. Like I know about creating tokens or signing secrets and stuff like that. So for people that don't, it's going to be more of a jump to try and implement it themselves.
I think we've said this probably 100 times on the podcast, but like everyone listening, go write your own auth just once. It's not that hard. It's a really good learning experience. You'll understand how these things work, and you're also not going to be spending $1 bazillion on some SaaS that uses to log in.
Yeah. People feel like it's high stakes, but like session-based auth is really pretty simple.
It's all the features that are like once you start getting log in with Twitter or whatever, you can do those, but like a simple username, password, confirm, password reset link, that stuff, you could do that.
Yeah. If you want to see some examples on how I approach this, I did link to my hand-rolled auth that I use, and it's just a really simple session-based authentication, which I think is more than enough for most people. Here's one that we don't talk about enough is, does it include email? Like Adonis.js includes an email package, which granted, I just think that's nice sometimes. One of the things I love about PocketBase is that when I make an account on PocketBase, it automatically sends the email. All I have to do is put in my email credentials into their UI if I want to use a third-party, mailer service, which you probably do. But like you just drop in those things and it automatically does all that stuff. You want to update the templates, whatever. Meteor did that too. And in fact, if you didn't have your email creds set up within Meteor, it just output the email to the console. So when you were testing before you went live, you could just click and copy and paste from there. And it was a great experience. It was just nice to have that baked in.
Next one we have here is, what does a TypeScript story look like? I think almost all of them now allow you to simply just write TypeScript and it just runs, which is beautiful. Previously, you had to like run some sort of weird compile step on a lot of them. But are the routes fully typed? Is it possible to write a link to something that is not a route that exists? That's a big one, right? Or can you get access to the parameters of a URL route are those fully typed, or do you have to? Are you just assuming they're there? You have to check if they're there. That's kind of annoying as well. So, deep integration with TypeScript is a major benefit to me.
How does it handle images? Does it handle images? Do you just left to drop it in static, or does there some kind of process, or even better, like, can it handle automatically uploading images and throwing them into a folder or a bucket for you and having that all configured? So what does it do about static files, images, uploads, those types of things?
Creating like a source set. That was, I think Gatsby was like one of the first in that space where you simply just uploaded a 18 megabyte from your camera, and then it would just chop up and make a million different versions of your image for you. And then there's also like the Next.js image component has some pretty good documentation on how to use stuff that's not the Vercel image. So if you want to use like your own hand-rolled thing, or you want to use Cloudinary, which is what I use on a lot of my websites, there's a lot of good stories there. But just basically, like, do I have to now write this whole thing myself? Is a big question, because images are a hard one.
Word.
And then also, how do we work with CSS? So we know there's a million and one ways to work with CSS in the JavaScript ecosystem. So for instance, like in SvelteKit or even in like Nuxt or Vue, they have scoped styles by default. So you define styles in your component and they're only scoped to that component. But for other frameworks, especially React-based, you need to use other things like CSS modules or CSS and JS and all of those various solutions like StyleX and Panda and styled components. And then also these days, a lot of people are choosing to use something like Tailwind. So does it support Tailwind? And a lot of times you need to make sure that, especially if you're doing server-side rendering, there's some sort of mechanism there that's going to allow Tailwind to be included in those server-rendered bundles. And then one of the things that I like to look out for, because I write a lot less of my own CSS, is there good support for component libraries? If you're not wanting to write all of your styles from scratch, you might want to reach for something like Daisy UI or Flowbyte, these things that basically give you pre-built components. And if you're trying to integrate those with some frameworks, they might not have the best support. So like if you're trying to there's Daisy UI React, and if you try to bring that into Next.js, every single component that tries to bring one in one of those components has to be marked as a client component because the library hasn't taken that into account yet.
Yeah, that's a huge pain in the butt. And you got to wrap it. Every single component you have to wrap.
Yep. I think they're trying to fix it, but yeah, it's super annoying.
Yeah. One thing that I think I have a hard time with that other folks might in the JavaScript ecosystem is, how long has this thing been around? Is it version pre-1? If it's version pre-1, I'm like that meme where I'm looking back at it like, ooh, ooh, a pre-version 1 JavaScript framework, my kind of thing, huh? But yeah, I do think that matters. Like, how many times have they had to do small rewrites, API thrash, things like that? Even with this new Svelte 5 stuff, I love the way Svelte 5 works, but I'm not stoked to have to rewrite so many apps to it. Even though the version 4 code will continue to work when you upgrade to version 5, you're not going to want to hang on. I did this with React. I did this 800 times with React, and I'm tired of it. So I would like some stability, please.
Yeah. The API thrash and the breaking changes and things change is so frustrating at some points. Like, there's something to be said for picking older tech. I have Express code that I've written 10 years ago, and it still runs today. And I've upgraded it many times throughout the versions, and it's almost always like a 10-15 minute upgrade, whereas like not this huge, this is how we approach it, or we're doing it this new way, but the old way is now supported, so now you're thinking, there's two different ways to do things. It's kind of frustrating. That's what we've done to ourselves here as JavaScript developers. We want new and exciting stuff, but we also want it to stop changing.
Yeah.
But like on that same point, like, what does the ecosystem look like? Is there editor plugins? Are there different libraries that work with it? I think the like whole library thing is getting a lot better with the move to people either writing them in vanilla and then just providing like a headless interface for it. Like, a lot of the tan stack stuff is 98% vanilla JavaScript, and then there's just they just write like a React version for it to actually integrate it, right? And then a lot of the stuff is now like web components. And okay, well, you look at the shoelace or the font web awesome stuff. Those are those new web component UI libraries that they're working on. That's great. You don't have to we shouldn't have to have a React specific charting library. It should work with all the frameworks.
Yes, all of the above. Also, community support, which is an often underlooked thing. How many people are there in the Discord, or even better, like how active are the discussions in forums like that? I'm kind of over Discord as a tool for maintaining community, but I get it as being like a nice thing. I love an active community in general, though, because it means that people are not just using it, they're interested in it and excited about it and like wanting to talk about it, which is a big thing. If people are wanting to talk about their tools, it means that they're invested in their tools.
Yeah. And I think also beyond that, like, I want to make sure that I can get help when I need it, right? So like, are the GitHub discussions active? Are the GitHub issues active? Like, if you come across this new shiny framework and you go and you look at the GitHub issues, but none of them have been answered in a year, you're probably going to have a hard time getting your answers, but also you might run into those same issues that those people are opening up. So we definitely want to see active maintainers and active community members that are helping people out.
Yeah, sometimes it's so frustrating when like I literally don't have anybody I can ask about this actual issue, and like the maintainer is super overwhelmed. You know, it shouldn't have to be the maintainer's job to also do the support. They're not going to get anything done. But you also want your questions answered. How do I do this? I'm hitting this specific issue. Is it my issue? Like so many times I've used smaller things and I've spent an hour on something that's broken, and then it turns out to be a bug in the library, and it goes, oh, it wasn't me. I thought it was.
I said sometimes it is you though, but
often it is me. Yes. It's almost always me. That's why I default to that.
Yes, exactly.
Portability. How easily can you duck out of this thing? So we talk a lot about web standards. So a lot of these API requests, if you write them with standards, form data, request, response, fetch, 98% of that JavaScript code is you can move it over to something else. If you know what, this isn't for me, I can still move the login route handler to something else, you know? How easy is it to move your actual components, you know? If it's going from a React framework to React framework, it's pretty easy. Most of that will move over. It's just React. If it's going from React to JSX, that's a little bit different. You got to decide, now all of a sudden my use state doesn't work. I gotta move those over to what the equivalent is. But then if is it a React to something totally different, then you got to rewrite a lot of your components.
Word.
And then finally, hiring doesn't matter to you. Quite honestly, that's why React is still very popular, right? There's lots of people out there that write React. There's lots of stuff built on React. And if you need to be able to hire an expert in that type of thing, then you will be able to do it. Granted, somebody who's good at JavaScript will be able to pick up any of these frameworks, but that's not something a lot of people look at when they're looking at what does the hiring landscape look like.
Yeah, sick. I think that was really a great discussion, y'all. I mean, there's so much that goes into here. If you have things specifically that you look for in a framework that we didn't mention, leave a comment below. Or heck, if any of these things that we mentioned aren't important, leave a comment below. Or what do you think a framework is? That's like the best question here. I think when we kick this off, I think everybody has a very different idea of a framework. Is React a library? Is a hot dog a sandwich? Any of that same old discussion. So let us know what you think in the comments below. Now's the part of the show where we get into sick picks and shameless plugs. CJ, did you come with a sick pick today?
I completely forgot, but I'm just looking around my desk and I have one. It is
That's a classic.
Well, it's a cassette, but it is the latest album by Tycho. It's called Infinite Health. And he is, they are. It's one artist, but he tours with a band. It's instrumental music, great for programming too, great for getting stuff done. But the latest album is awesome. I've had this on repeat. Infinite Health by Tycho.
Did you know that I used to work for Ghostly International?
We had talked about that. Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah. Tycho is on Ghostly. I don't know if he still is. They were.
Yeah, I think he's on something. Mom and Pop. He was. I think his latest stuff hasn't been released on there.
Yeah, on Ghostly for a while, but I've been a big Tycho fan since like forever and ever and ever. And you're so right. Sometimes that music feels like you're swimming underwater or something like that. It's the best. Yeah.
I'm gonna sick pick citric acid. Which, do you guys know what citric acid is?
It's vitamin C. Yes, vitamin C.
Is it vitamin C? Oh, I didn't even know that. I just thought it was the stuff they put on like Sour Patch Kids to make them sour. But I bought a huge bag of it because we have so many things that need to be descaled in our house, right? We have a coffee maker, we have a kettle, we have this egg cooker. I should sick pick the egg cooker, actually. I've never sick picked that. We have our dishwasher. There's a baby Brezza, which is this like Keurig for formula for babies. Like there's so many things in our life that we need to descale. And I was buying this like really expensive descaler and I was like, what's in this stuff that it's so expensive? And it turns out like you can use vinegar to descale your coffee machine and whatnot, but it's actually not great for it, especially when like we have a really nice coffee maker and I don't want to goof it up. So I was like, I'm just going to buy a big bag what's this stuff called? Citric acid. And
Yeah.
this stuff is amazing. Like, I used to pour vinegar into something like our kettle that needed to be descaled, and I would
really?
just let it sit. Or like we have these humidifiers for the kids, and we'd have to pour vinegar and let it sit for like half a day or whatever, and then it would disintegrate. I pour citric acid and hot water into the kettle, and like 3 minutes later, it was like gone, just absolutely blasted. And I was like, man, why have I not been using this forever? It's relatively cheap. You get a huge bag for a couple bucks, and you descale your life.
I want to fact check myself. Citric acid is not vitamin C. It is similar.
Okay.
Ascorbic acid is vitamin C.
Oh,
So
okay.
sorry, y'all, I messed that one up. But I also use citric acid for cleaning my Zojirushi water cooker, and that's like the way that it comes with the cleaning pouches. So yeah, that stuff works super duper well.
Yeah, anything that makes water hot will get mineral buildup over time. And the sad thing, like I go to a lot of thrift stores and I look at all these things people have donated, and it's kind of sad to me because it's like, obviously this didn't work as well anymore, so they got a new one, and it kills me because it's like, just clean your stuff and it will last longer.
Yeah, that is quite literally a great life hack. Clean your stuff. I'm gonna pick a small little thing I just recently got, which makes too much sense. If you're like me, you have a lot of little USB, like the old USB style things sitting around, USB-A, whatever, and a lot of the new things USB-C. So I just got like a pack of these USB-A to little USB-C adapters. I put them all like in my car USBs. Yeah, it's just itty bitty ones like that, and they're so cheap. You can buy them a whole bunch. Oh, mine are even way smaller than that.
Are they?
Yeah, they're almost like they barely even stick out at all. I wish I had one sitting here, but they're just itty bitty.
Oh yeah,
yeah. And like I said, I put them in my car, on my car USB ports. I put them in my kitchen, and everywhere. So these things just give some extension to your USB-A ports.
I'm so excited. I'm getting a new iPhone soon, and my wife is too, and that means that aside from one iPad, our whole life will be USB-C. And like,
Yes.
I've been waiting for this moment like my entire life. And like, I even, these headphones I'm wearing are micro USB, and there's a mod that you can convert them to USB-C, but it's like $50. I don't know if it's worth it, but I just want to get rid of all the things that are not USB-C. This is great. I'm going to get some of these.
Yeah, I know. I have nothing that's not USB-C really anymore, so I'm way off that. So
Man.
Happy to be here. Shameless plugs. Check out the Syntax YouTube channel. We're on YouTube. CJ just released an awesome video at the time of recording this. Build a documented type-safe API with Do you say Hono? Hono?
It's Hono. We've been saying it wrong.
It's one of those things where I've just like, I can't get it right in my brain. Hono, Zod, Drizzle, Open API, Scalar. What is Scalar, CJ?
Scalar is the interactive API documentation. So it's similar to Swagger UI, but it's a bit more modern.
Yeah.
Like if you've ever been to API docs and like you see all the endpoints, but then like it shows you code you can paste to like run it with curl or run it with Python or whatever, Scalar gives you that. So you feed it the Open API spec and then you get interactive docs.
Sick. And the Scalar folks even commented on that video. So shout out to Scalar.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, that's all I got. You guys got anything? No? Silence from the crowd.
I got nothing. Yeah. Wrap her up.
All right. Peace.
Peace.